Hey y'all, my name is Josh Clark. Welcome back to the ScaleTrains channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to add burn marks to a GE locomotive. So a lot of times you'll notice if you're out trackside, you see a GEVO or a Dash 9 come by, these things a lot of times catch on fire. It's pretty unfortunate for the railroads, but it's really fun to model. So we're going to try to recreate that today. And it's really a neat way to make these locomotives stand out on a layout and stand out in a fleet as well. So they're definitely eye-catching locomotives once you do them right and get those burn marks looking good. So that's what we're going to take a look at for the next few minutes. So I hope you enjoy and can learn something. It's time to model. Welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at how to add burn marks. So over the next few minutes we're going to be really adding a little bit of a nice extra touch to the weathering on this locomotive. And this is a ScaleTrains Dash 9. It's pretty much just a base model of weathering, no extra detail parts. Came straight from the factory like this, so kudos to ScaleTrains for really creating a nice model, a nice base model to start weathering with. One other thing I did to this locomotive is renumber it so that it's actually modeled exactly after the prototype. The rear locomotive is 5091, and it obviously caught fire in the past because in looking through prototype pictures, I found that the whole conductor side of the long hood is actually kind of charred, and the paint's pretty messed up from how things got heated up and how it caught on fire. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to start with the base layer. One thing I've noticed just in weathering in general is that layers are really key to a good looking weathering job, and that same thing applies to weathering burn marks and adding burn marks. So we're going to start with layers. We're going to start with actually a white, which might be counterintuitive. It's not quite what you think to model if you're trying to represent, burnt metal, which is going to be a brown rust color. However, it's actually the primer. So GE usually paints a primer, which is kind of a grayish white color here, which is what we have. And then it burns through the primer onto the metal itself. And that's what we're going to try to represent and recreate here. Just a little bit of background. If you want to see pictures of the real 5091 and kind of see what I'm looking at while I'm painting this and modeling here, just do a quick Google search of BNSF space 5091. You'll be able to see a few pictures of the locomotive and the exact type of weathering and burn marks that I'm modeling here. And just a little bit of extra background. What these burn marks are is usually GEs are notorious for, I think it's blowing a turbocharger. There's something that goes wrong within the engine when things kind of heat up or will either catch on fire. And it happens more often than you'd think, and it's pretty common, I guess somewhat common, to see remnants of that fire on the paint scheme of the locomotive. So that's what we're representing here. And like I said, you can look at pictures of the real locomotive 5091 to see just how close we're going to try to get it today. And so that's what I have in front of me while I'm filming this, is a picture of the prototype. And like I said, you can kind of see what we're going for if you look at that up. One thing to note here is a lot of times these locomotives will run around for years without having their paint fixed. So it's a neat aspect to model. It definitely is impressive once you finish it and adds a little bit of extra realism to your weathering. So this is actually an off-white. I think it's a cement color. It's made by Model Master. That you can use any sort of white or off-white paint. Or if you can't find the exact color, you can always take just white paint and mix a touch of brown or even just a touch of black with it to just tone it down a little bit. I think that's going to look better than just a standard white. I prefer using enamel paints, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with acrylic paints. It's just you got to make sure you have paint thinner to clean your brushes afterwards. So we're going to continue painting here. Like I said, I'm just following the pictures of the prototype, and we're really going to kind of add the gray here first, and then we'll come back and start adding the rust and the brown later. Another neat thing to do is a dry brushing technique, and we'll look a little bit more when we add the rust, but that's where you actually get paint on your brush and then you dab some of the paint off on either paper towel or a napkin, and then you can apply just very lightly a light coat of paint. Another thing you can see here is that I'm going back and actually dabbing the paint. I'm using the paintbrush to add a little bit of texture. And you can see here that just by doing that, I'm able to kind of create a neat charred effect. And it also covers a couple of the spots which didn't cover quite as well. You also notice that there's a little part of the yellow F in BNSF that I didn't paint over, and that was intentional. If you look at the prototype pictures, there's for some reason one little part in the middle of that door that didn't get burnt, totally scorched like everything around it. So fire has its way of being kind of weird and unpredictable, so I guess that's why it didn't quite burn the top of the F off of the BNSF on the long hood here. So like I said, the key is really in layers. So now I'm gonna come back with a standard white and kind of mix it in. One thing I've done here is actually mixed the white with a little bit of paint thinner. So we have about 50% paint to about 50% paint thinner. And like I said, this is just a standard white. And what we're doing here is actually creating a charred effect and a little more charred effect. And if you look at the prototype picture, you'll see that the primer is actually variable in color. It's a little lighter and darker in some places than others. And I think the reason for that is just how the heat got to it and it changed the color as it burned its way through. So that's what we're trying to recreate here. One thing to keep in mind is that the paint thinner is actually going to help you mix the paints, and that was intentional, but you just want to make sure that if you're mixing multiple colors like this, that you have the same base, so that you're mixing enamel paints with enamel paints or acrylic paints with acrylic paints. If you try mixing acrylic with enamel paints, obviously the two different solvents and bases for the paints won't mix well together. And I'm just going to come back and cover a little bit more of it. You can see some of that yellow stripe on the top, kind of showing through the white a little bit. Most of that will be covered up with rust, but just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and cover that up with paint. And you can see as this starts to dry, you can see that neat texture, which we're going to continue building. I've noticed that sometimes the camera picks up the texture from the shadows a little bit more than you would see with your naked eye, but in person it comes out to be this really cool looking effect. And if you actually want to get more of a charred and textured effect, you can actually mix your paint, whether it's acrylic or enamel, with some weathering powders. Those are pretty much like a chalk that you can buy from a hobby store, and that actually is, when you mix the paint with the chalk, it creates this really cool textured paint. It's almost like a putty, but you can use an old paintbrush to kind of dab that on, and what that'll actually do is give you even more of a charred effect. So this is a neat way to do it with a brush as it's drying, but if you want to get even more of that effect, try practicing with some of the mixed paint and powder. I do that a lot with weathering on box cars and freight cars, and it works well here with the charred metal effect. Another thing, if you're trying to model burn marks, is you'll notice they're not very even. Usually they are kind of in the middle of the long hood here, but sometimes they're just on one side, sometimes they're on both sides, sometimes it's just a little part of the long hood, and I think that's really dependent on how bad the failure was and then how quickly the fire department could get there to put out the fire. Because a lot of times when these fires happen and a GE locomotive does blow a turbo and catches on fire, sometimes it's out in the middle of nowhere, and they do have to get the fire department out there to put these things out. So it's kind of interesting. You can look up some videos on YouTube and probably see some videos of a GE locomotive, whether it's a Dash 9 or an AC 4400 or a GEVO, quote unquote blowing a turbo, I think is what they call it. And it's kind of fun to watch, and you can see it catch on fire and see kind of what causes this and what we're trying to model here. So the next thing we're going to do is come back and apply just a little bit of brown. We're going to start layering the rust and the charred metal effect here. So this is just a rust color. It's made by Model Master, so it's an enamel paint. Again, it'll mix well with the undercoat of the primer color, the whitish color that we have underneath. So you can see here I've thinned it a little bit, and it's going to cause it to really mix with the primer coat underneath, and that'll give us that neat effect of the mixed colors and what you'd see there. Again, referencing the prototype picture, you'll see that I'm really trying to create the rust effect just like it's found on the prototype. If you're uncomfortable with trying some of these techniques on a brand new ScaleTrains engine, I totally don't blame you. I've been doing these techniques for quite a while, so I'm pretty comfortable with it. But if you're not, I would recommend, practicing these techniques on, an old locomotive or an old car. Even if that doesn't work for you, get an old piece of cardboard or even an old cereal box, and you can really practice these techniques on that before taking them to your locomotive. And I think that's a really great way to practice, because a lot of times practice makes perfect, or at least it helps you get better at it. It can be intimidating to do stuff like this to a brand new, really nice locomotive like this ScaleTrains Dash 9. So actually, if you haven't done this before, there's nothing wrong with giving it a shot. but I actually recommend practicing a little bit just on some scrap material to kind of get these techniques down and kind of to understand how the paint works and mixes with each other. And the nice thing is, the paint from the factory is very sturdy, so if I were to mess something up here, what I could do is, put some gloves on and soak a rag or something in some of the solvent. So in this case, it would be a paint thinner, and I could almost wipe it off. And I've done that a lot of times, and sometimes I've found that actually accidents lead to really neat effects. So, in wiping it off, maybe it creates a cool burn mark. That's a rabbit trail. But anyways, luckily with the paints I'm working with here with enamel paints by Model Master, even after it dries, it's fairly easy to remove and take the weathering off in case you mess something up. So hopefully that's not the case, but just a little tip there in case you need to go back and fix something. Here, as I've been talking, you can see I've been adding the darker brown. And what this is I think a dark military brown, again by Model Master. Same solvent, same company, so I know the paints are gonna mix well together. That was pretty much straight out of the bottle, but I did dry brush it, so I got some of the paint off in a paper towel. And then you can see after I applied it, I used a separate brush to kind of mix those paints together. Gives it a neat effect. Next I'm gonna start working on the top. So you can see I just put a little paint up there, and I'm gonna, instead of continuing to get more paint, just spread that paint out because I want somewhat of a thin layer. And you can see I put the dab of paint right in the middle of the primer spot and then spread it outwards. And the reason I did that is as it gets farther out, the paint gets thinner and it actually mixes well and blends better as the paint kind of thins out and tapers out to the primer. That's kind of the effect we're going for. So we're going to keep working our way towards the rear of the locomotive here. You can see the paint is somewhat thick. It's unthinned at this point, and that is kind of what's going to give us that neat texture that I've been talking about. Now with these burn marks, like I said, fire's unpredictable, so that it's pretty hard to go wrong as far as modeling the rust here. I'm modeling a particular locomotive, so I'm trying to replicate that. But if you're just trying to freehand, some of this stuff, you can really make it look any way you want, and it'll still look good, and it'll still look prototypical. But like I mentioned, the primer is going to be on the outside of these burn marks. And like I said, the paint's going to burn through, the lettering first, which will be the yellow and the stripes. Then as it gets hotter, it'll burn through the orange, then it'll burn down to the primer, and then it'll burn all the way down to the bare metal and start to char that and make the colors change. So that's why you see the color variation and changes from the primer to the rust. And then, the orange is obviously on the very outside of that. So you can see here, I'm really just pulling the paint down. If I run a little bit short, I'll get a little bit more, but you can see that just by putting one dot of paint on the top of a door panel, you're really able to pull it all the way down to the bottom of it without too much work. I'm now gonna come back and get some of that dark military brown. I think it's mixed with a little bit of grimy black, again by Model Master. Those two mixed to kind of create a neat burnt metal look I've found. And using the dry brush here, I'm just gonna mix those colors together to give us that neat blended look. So we're back. You can see things have dried a little bit, and I've actually given it a clear coat. I like to use a dull coat just to make sure that the paint's not gonna come off when I start this next step. So what we're gonna do now is use a little bit of weathering powders to kind of blend everything together. Like I said, this is all about layers and then blending those layers together. And you can see some of the edges are a little bit rough. You can see some paint strokes and lines here and there, and that's okay. This next step, using some weathering powders, is really gonna help hide that and blend all this together. So what I'm using here is just a little bit of light brown rust color. This is made by AIM Weathering Powders. That's A as in Alpha, I as in Igloo, M as in Mike. So AIM Weathering Powders, you can find them from most of your local hobby stores or online. And just using a small brush, I'm gonna put this on. One thing to keep in mind when you're using weathering powders, whether you're adding burn marks, weathering a locomotive, or weathering a car, is that you're always gonna wanna clear coat it. Since it's a powder, it's kind of like makeup more or less, I guess, but it'll rub off. So in clear coating it, you're able to really protect it and seal it in to make sure that it's not gonna come off whenever you pick it up or someone touches the locomotive. So here I'm leaving the middle, the darkest color. That'll be where the heat was probably the most intense, I'm guessing. I'm going to come back and add a few spots here and there, but really trying to blend the outside edges. And then if you get too much powder on, it's pretty easy to just blow it off. Here I'm coming back with a little bit of black weathering powder, again by AIM, and just kind of smoothing out and evening out the center of the burn mark here, and then blending that with the surrounding areas. You can see a little bit of the powders fell onto the side of the locomotive, and I was able to just blow that away. And these powders, the AIM weathering powders, even though we didn't do it in this video, are the same ones that I would mix the paint with to give you a really neat kind of chunky, thick paint that you can create that texture with. Next, we're going to head over to the paint booth and give this thing a quick clear coat to seal everything in and protect our weathering job. Really just make sure everything's sealed in. And that should do it.